today by talking a little bit about some research that was just recently accepted for publication in Psych Science. So let's get started. As you probably know by the last day of this conference, STEM stands for Science, Technology, Engineering, and Math fields. And despite the fact that women have been increasingly participating in the workforce over the last 50 or so years, there still tends to be an underrepresentation of women in STEM fields. So just for instance, only a few years ago, about only 20% of engineering bachelor's degrees were awarded to women. As women advance down the career path, women seem to be leaving at a higher rate than men, a phenomenon that's been referred to as the leaky pipeline. And in fact, once women enter the workforce, it turns out that women are about twice as likely as men to leave their jobs in STEM. So researchers from a variety of fields have taken different perspectives in trying to understand why this might be the case. And one recurring theme is that there are negative stereotypes about women's STEM and math abilities that might contribute to this gender gap. So for instance, studies of women's experience in the STEM environment has found that female students perceive less encouragement from their advisors than do male students. And women also perceive a more unwelcoming environment than men. So why might this be? In the present study, we take what's called an identity compatibility approach. Let me tell you a little bit about what that means. So, although social psychologists often like to think about identity in a somewhat narrow way, I'm a woman, I'm white, I'm a social psychologist, we actually hold multiple social identities simultaneously. And while sometimes the source of our social identities can be a source of connection or belonging or warmth, if we have different identities that exist in conflict, that can be an aversive experience. So just to give you an example of what this identity conflict might look like, if we take Vin Diesel in the movie The Pacifier, he plays a male nanny. And his male identity might undermine his success as a nanny. And the more successful he is as a nanny, the more that might undermine his male identity. So these two identities may exist in conflict. And we believe that's what's going on with women in STEM fields. So while perhaps not as bold and explicit as Vin Diesel in The Pacifier, stereotypes about women as scientists may be somewhat incompatible. So when we think about the kind of stereotypes we have of traditional mathematicians or scientists, we might think of these sort of reclusive, non-social men who have this extreme value for logic and not emotion. In stark contrast, if we think about stereotypes about women, we think of women as somewhat more emotional, feelings are valuable, and also affiliative, that interconnectedness is important and that being part of a group is important. And just to sort of drive home the point that women don't necessarily signal STEM and mathiness, the person in this picture on the right is actually my sister-in-law, who is a professor of mechanical engineering. But I suspect when you saw this image, the first thing that jumped to your mind was not, she looks like a mechanical engineer. So these two identities may exist somewhat in conflict. And what researchers have found is that seeing these two identities as either in conflict or as compatible is highly predictive of women's success in the STEM fields. So a variety of studies have suggested that this identity compatibility, perceiving one's gender identity and STEM identity as compatible, is related for women who are not yet in STEM fields, interest in pursuing these careers. So both cues in the environment as well as communal goals, which are compatible with female gender identity, seem to be related to predicting interest in STEM fields. And as someone in a talk yesterday mentioned, interest in pursuing STEM actually tends to be very predictive of STEM success, even more so than ability or self-efficacy. Moreover, identity compatibility seems to be predictive among STEM women. So one study found that among women who were already majoring in STEM, identity compatibility was related to improved sense of belonging and motivation, and also security in STEM. In contrast, research on incompatibility, so perceiving them as not compatible, has found that women in STEM fields have poorer self-esteem and poorer performance as a scientist. So not only does it seem to be affected affecting one's belonging or subjective experience, but it might also be affecting actual academic success. So while all these studies seem to suggest recently that identity compatibility might be an important predictor for STEM success, it's unclear how women conceive their gender and their STEM identities as either compatible or incompatible. So in the present study, we propose that identity compatibility might be damaged by threatening cues in the environment. So many of you are likely familiar with stereotype and social identity threats. So for instance, women in STEM fields are exposed to fewer female peers and fewer female exemplars of STEM success. And it stands to reason that if you're a woman walking into your first engineering course, if you look around and see that there are very few women around you, this might make you question whether or not you belong, whether or not women are compatible with this field. So we suggest that threatening cues in the environment might impair compatibility. While in the past, prejudice and bias has been extremely overt, research in the prejudice domain over the last several years has suggested that modern forms of prejudice might actually be more subtle or ambiguous. So it's no longer common for a math professor to announce that women don't belong in that classroom, but it might be more common for a man to react with surprise when his female student does extremely well on her test. So these kinds of threats in the environment are no longer extremely obvious, and because of that, individuals vary in whether they pick up these subtle forms of threat. Gender-based rejection sensitivity is a model that we use in our study to identify those who are most attuned to these threats, so these subtle, ambiguous threats. And so gender rejection sensitivity, or gender RS, is a social cognitive individual difference measure. And like I mentioned, it's designed to predict the increased perceptions of threat and negative responses to threat in the environment. So as we mentioned before, we theorize that identity compatibility might be negatively affected by threats in the environment. So to the extent that people are picking up on more threats in the environment, they may be having more sort of hits to their identity compatibility. And ultimately, this exposure to threat over time might eventually result in sort of an unstable identity compatibility. Facing threats over and over again might constantly have their identity compatibility in flux. And this idea is supported by past work with other disadvantaged groups. So Aronson and Inslick found several years ago that perceptions of threat among African Americans predicted unstable academic self-efficacy, right? So this stereotype relevant self-perception for African Americans about intelligence. And they also theorized that this instability in itself might be damaging. However, they did not go on to test that theory. So we wanted to extend this logic and ask whether perceptions of threat might lead to unstable identity compatibility instead of unstable academic self-efficacy. Okay, so in the present study, we conducted a longitudinal study of female STEM majors. So, at background, participants completed a questionnaire immediately before beginning their freshman semester of college. We then followed them into their spring semester, their second semester, and gave them weekly diary studies. So every week they had to answer a series of measures across the entire semester. Finally, the next fall, we followed up with them to see how they were doing. So just to give you a quick look at our model. First, we have gender rejection sensitivity, which was administered at background. And as past work has suggested, those who are high in gender RS tend to perceive more threat in the environment. So we administered the gender RSQ, which, like I said, is designed to identify those who are more perceptive of threat. And by completing this measure, participants read 6 scenarios in which bias is possible. So for instance, meeting your male advisor for the first time. And then they're asked to rate how likely it is that they might experience bias and how aversive it would be to them if they did experience some form of bias.